Okay.
Hi, Dr. Dianandan. Welcome to the Sat Speaks podcast. How are things going today?
Things are
Thank you.
going great, and thank you for having me. It's my
Yeah,
exquisite pleasure to be
thank you
here.
for meeting with me. Feel free to introduce yourselves to our listeners.
I am Riwat Deonandan. I'm an epidemiologist and associate professor at the Interdisciplinary School of Health Sciences at the University of Ottawa, and currently the holder of the research chair in university teaching.
Nice. Well, it's great to have you here. Once again, thank you for being here. So, why don't we just get right into it?
Let's do it.
So, you have been on the news countless times during the pandemic, seasoned epidemiologist. We've worked on a research project regarding like misinformation during the pandemic and the Canadian response. Can you explain the influence of social media on the transmission of misinformation during the pandemic?
Um, so the age of your audience is relevant here. So for people like under 25 years old, you might not remember a time before the internet when we got our news from the newspaper and from network TV, which was like 3 or 4 channels, the evening news. So it was difficult to spread both information and misinformation, and information was the sole purview of mainstream media. With the rise of the internet and of the blogosphere and of discussion forums and now of social media has come the opportunity for both good and bad things. In terms of good things, early on in the pandemic, it was difficult to get up to date information because journalists weren't publishing fast enough. They didn't know what to publish. Scientists were hard to get a hold of. And so you found a couple of scientists online who were willing to speak. And really, I can count them on one hand how many there were. And you follow them for to save your life, and maybe they'd mention things like, I've got data about the disease happening here and there. Quickly, though, the bad aspects of social media started to show its worth. And by that I mean, if you are a disinformation merchant, someone who specializes in sowing disinformation for the purposes of producing calamity in a society, and those agents do exist, social media is the ideal venue for this. You can plant falsehoods, and they will take root quite quickly. And it's difficult to correct a falsehood once it's found purchase. Also, you can tailor make your falsehood to correspond to the psychologies of the people you're trying to reach. You're never going to lose traction with an audience if you tell them something they already believe. So if you already want to believe that the crisis is over and everything's back to normal, everything's safe, telling them that is going to win them over. Telling them they need to be nervous and take precautions is not going to win them over. So social media, in many ways, lubricates the path of the lie better than it lubricates the path of the truth. And that's the problem and threat of social media. It's not an equal opportunity avenue for information. It does reward some kinds of messages more than others. And it rewards short, perfunctory, concise messages, which usually are the ones that are least full of factual information.
Mhm. Yeah, no, it's pretty crazy. I mean, you know, I'm I don't know life before the internet, right? Like I know all my information during the pandemic was from the way I was getting information before, right? Just going on to Instagram, Twitter, or whatever it's called now, and just seeing what someone who says they're an MD says, or what someone who says they're a professional says. So yeah,
Sorry,
how
I try to interrupt you. Make a good point there, but you can't verify credentials on
yeah.
Twitter. I mean, you can Google on the side, but what as we discovered during the pandemic is credentials aren't they aren't the absolute arbiter of truthfulness.
Mhm.
And a lot of the general population doesn't understand the difference between an MD and a PhD, for example, or the fact that just because you're a doctor doesn't mean you understand infectious disease transmission at a population level, or just because you're a PhD, as I am, doesn't mean you understand clinical care. So
Mhm.
it also played upon the ignorances of the population in terms of expertise, credentialism, and a host of other factors, including basic scientific literacy.
Yeah. So, how do you think this affected like the public's trust, and how do you think that the public's trust impacted the response to the pandemic?
Even before the pandemic happened, the ground was lain with mistrust. And
Mm.
we saw the first hints of it in dramatic fashion, frankly, when Donald Trump was elected president, 2016. Um, his election signaled to the punditocracy that, oh my goodness, there is a genuine bubbling discontentment in the American population and therefore the Canadian population, and therefore, frankly, the population of the Western world as a whole, a growing distrust of all authority figures. And authority figures includes politicians, media, academics, so-called experts, doctors, etc. That's always been there. What the disinformation campaign, if you want to call it that, and by the way, it was a campaign and to a large extent, this is well documented by American intelligence officials and Canadian intelligence officials that certain foreign governments were deliberately planting in, disinformation around COVID for political purposes. And that was taken up by people I would call useful idiots who ran with it, and taken up by people who were frankly paid to run with it and push that narrative more and more into the public. So if you understand that there's already a growing discontentment with authority figures in society, and you wish to soothe further discontent, you are well advised to prize apart further that ideological divide. And that's exactly what happened.
Mhm.
Pandemics have a history. We've known this, those of us who study pandemics, we've known this for a while. Pandemics have a history of exacerbating existing divides in society. And those divides historically have been between rich and poor, male and female, white and non-white, whatever it might be. But now that divide is between left and right. And that's the major division we see around the disinformation impacts. Um, and so how that affects trust, well, it's rolled into the trust factor. We have an enormous population that distrusts the quote unquote mainstream. And the mainstream to them is the existing authoritative institutions. I was asked early on in the pandemic by a reporter where to go for proper information. And my answer back then was, well, you can't trust the government websites, not because they're wrong, they're just not up to date.
Yeah.
You can't trust the media, not because they're trying to lie to you, they just haven't got the most up-to-date information. You can't trust what people on Twitter say because who knows who they are. And I
Yeah.
said, the best information is university websites because they have a vested interest in
Mhm.
maintaining somewhat proper data. And at the time, I was thinking of Johns Hopkins in particular,
Mhm.
that had a really excellent COVID dashboard. Since then, more trusted venues have arisen for proper information. If I were to be asked that question today, I'm not sure how I would answer it. Not because the information offered by university websites is wrong, it's because I don't know who wants to hear the answer.
Yeah.
There's just so much fundamental distrust, and I don't know how we address it. I really don't.
Really. And like, so my follow-up question would be like, in an ideal world, how would you reestablish this trust or avoid this distrust to happen
Right.
in the first place? Right?
Well,
Because
yeah, I
it's,
do
I
have
mean,
some
it's
thoughts on
deep
that.
rooted, right?
Yes, I have some thoughts on that. I think because I was asked the same question by journalists again sometime in 2020.
Yeah.
And my answer at the time, and I think I stick with this answer, is you have to identify personalities in society who have high trust. They don't necessarily have to be scientists or government officials, and you have to bring them on board to be the face of your messaging. Now, when I say this, the danger is that it sounds like marketing, and I don't want to go down the marketing path because when people see marketing, they understand they're being manipulated, and I don't want that to be the case. So, a couple of things have to happen. One, there has to be radical transparency. We have to be transparent in what we know, what we don't know, and we cannot be seen or even suspected to be trying to massage the message. That's from a previous generation of public health communication. An example of that I'll give is the tobacco campaign, anti-smoking campaigns from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Those were all well manicured and massaged and run by PR companies that were trying to enact an outcome. They're trying to change behavior. It worked to a large extent, but there is that intractable group of people who will never respond to it, who just don't like being told what to do. And so the more you tell them don't smoke, the more they're going to smoke.
Yeah.
With something like COVID and other kinds of public health emergencies, we're not taking away your right to smoke. We're taking away your right to do a whole lot of other fun things. And so the population that's going to be intractable is much larger. They can't get a whiff of the semblance that you're trying to change their behavior. That will not go down well. Therefore, the best you can do is present the information as plainly and transparently as you can and trust them to come to you, to see the truth for themselves. Anything short of that, I think, will fail. That's the first part. The second part is, again, as I mentioned, finding personalities that can be eventually trustworthy, but at least have a face. In Canada, the face of public messaging around COVID was, frankly, Theresa Tam for the longest time. And I mean, I have nothing against her. She's not a charismatic public figure, a dry speaker, does not engage the population, doesn't even look you in the eye when looking down a camera lens. It's not great.
Mm-hmm.
In Germany, on the other hand, they had Christian Drosten, who was their lead virologist, who spoke on all things related to COVID authoritatively, charismatically. He was always accessible, had a regular podcast and a blog. He was always in the public eye, and he was the face of the COVID response. In Sweden, they had Anders Tegnell, and other countries had other, figures they could attach the messaging to. It wasn't the government speaking. It wasn't this nameless, faceless amoeba
Yeah.
like institution that just had big brother like control over you. It was an individual who you could look up and look up to. Now, having such a person comes with a price. And that is, if that person fails you, then the entire house of cards comes down.
Yeah,
And
and
in
sorry,
the
just to
UK,
butt in here.
yeah,
You were speaking about Theresa Tam.
yeah,
What was also seen during the pandemic was a lot of other issues arising regarding her, like just her, like she is an Asian Canadian.
yeah,
This I feel like the second you start having an individual figure, you start getting a lot of other issues
yes, there's a
that come into
downside
that
to
as
this.
well,
You
right?
were tied to them. You were tied to
Mm-hmm.
their characteristics, for better
Yeah.
or worse. An example I was going to give was Neil Ferguson in the UK. He was the face of their original response, and he was eventually found to be breaking the lockdown rules to see his girlfriend. And and if you can't trust the guy who is advising the government and being the face of the pandemic response to actually follow
Mm-hmm.
the pandemic guidelines, then you've lost the plot already. So there comes with a danger. It can't just be one person, it has to be a few people. And not just to be the face of the response, but just to be the face of explaining things, just to
Mm-hmm.
explain things. That's all I would ask. Again, it's not a perfect solution, but those are the only two things that come to mind. And I think of the two, the transparency is key. For example, um, we originally, when the data around the vaccines came out in December of 2020, um, to any of us who reads RCT data, it's clear they did not test whether the vaccines were capable of diminishing transmission or preventing infection. The testing was only on, does it reduce symptomatic disease? And yet the messaging was, take the vaccine, stop transmission. Now, as a scientist, I know there's a very high likelihood that this vaccine would prevent transmission, but the RCT data did not say that,
Mm-hmm.
at least not the ones that were publicly available. And it was incumbent upon us to be transparent about that in December of 2020, to say this will prevent you from getting sick and from clogging the hospital system. It may or may not prevent transmission. Now, I said that on the news many times, others did not. And we're at a point today when the anti vaxxers are so adamantly against the vaccine. And one of the first things they say is, you lied to us about this stopping transmission. We didn't lie. This is what the RCT said. It's just
Mm-hmm.
that some people chose to be not as transparent as they could have been about the limitations about what was known.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're not transparent, it'll bite you in the ass later.
Yeah, no, for sure. So it's not just misinformation, it's about selective information spread as well that leads to issues.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I
Hmm.
should distinguish between misinformation and disinformation.
Hmm.
Misinformation is getting things wrong.
Hmm.
Disinformation is intentionally getting things wrong.
Hmm.
The first is forgivable. The second is evil.
Hmm.
And it's the second that continues to plague us today, the disinformation. And
Hmm.
it keeps on popping up with nameless bots on Twitter,
Yeah.
that keep pushing a narrative. Why are they nameless bots? Because they are literally produced in bot farms in certain countries I won't mention, specifically to sow discontent.
Mm-hmm.
So no matter how much we attempt to combat the misinformation, the disinformation merchants are better organized and better funded. And they're literally funded by government agencies with massive bankrolls. The other thing we haven't talked about is how does science respond?
Hmm.
Science historically responds with its one and only good tool, and that is peer review.
Yeah.
Peer review is not well equipped to fight battles in the social media age.
Yeah.
Do you know the average number of people who reads a peer reviewed article?
No.
No one knows, but there's some estimations that it's probably two, not including the
Really?
author. Two. That's it.
Wow.
Now some are read by millions, some are read by zero, but the
Uh-huh.
average turns out to be two. I mean, I could be wrong about that. There's a citation I could find probably, but the average number of people who watches an anti-vax YouTube video that's well designed, it's like in the millions,
Yeah.
and it can be put up overnight, and the next day millions have viewed it. And if you have a response in a peer-reviewed paper that takes months to make it to print,
Yeah.
it's read by a handful of people. Science loses that battle every time.
Yeah.
So social media is the battleground for public health information.
Mm.
Science is bringing a knife to a machine gun fight,
Yeah.
and this is why we fail.
So, and do you have any ideas of how science could, at least level the playing ground or at least
Yeah,
attempt to?
yeah. What we need is a well-funded full-time army of social media professionals whose
Mhm.
job it is to respond to this nonsense.
Yeah.
You flood them out. Don't lie. You don't, but you just flood them out with good information. During the pandemic, who's responsible for that? Nobody.
Yeah.
There are a handful of individuals, and I count myself among them, who did some of that work. We're not paid for it. It's not my job. My job is to be a professor at the university, but I took it upon myself to do some of that. And I know some colleagues did the same thing. The government, either federal or provincial, should be doing that, but they had other things to do. They were just not equipped and not ready for it, and really just overwhelmed. So, in absence of some kind of credible cadre of professionals with that capacity and energy, what ends up happening is the well funded, well organized disinformation army just overwhelms you.
Hmm.
Like the amount of time I would get nasty emails and messages from COVID minimizers and anti-vaxxers asking me, well, explain this, explain that. Like, all right. And I spent all night crafting a blog post with citations and all, knowing it's going to be read by hundreds of thousands of people, and I can't afford to make a mistake. And that would eat up my entire evening that I should be spending with my family, that I should be spending working on my actual thing that I'm paid for.
Hmm.
And and it's read by a few people, and then they say, well, okay, fine. What about this now? They want me to do it again the next night. So there just isn't enough time in the day and not enough resources for a handful of volunteers to do this.
Yeah.
Yet that is still where we are.
Hmm.
A handful of volunteers are the bulk work against literally well-funded, organized armies of misinformation and disinformation purveyors. So the solution must be that we must fund our own army to do this work.
Well, yeah, I mean, God forbid there's another big
Oh,
pandemic
it's
like
coming.
that. It's coming. It's part of like the natural cycle of the world. But um, you know, these are very important things to, I think, take note of. Have there been any like great cases of like countries that responded well, didn't have any of these issues, or was this so
Yeah,
novel that it had like
it's a good
this was just
question.
innate?
It's a good question. It depends on what stage of the pandemic we're talking about.
Yeah.
During, let's say, 2020, maybe early 21, the best responses were New Zealand, Vietnam,
Mhm.
places where COVID zero was appropriately pursued before Omicron became dominant, and Omicron really shut the door on the possibility of COVID zero. But I want to point to Bhutan. We don't talk enough about Bhutan. Bhutan had a handful of deaths and very few hospitalizations, and not a lot of cases to begin with, mostly because they trusted their leaders.
Mhm.
They have a culture of trust and a culture of caring for each other. There's an
Right.
element of culture here we haven't talked about. Individualized, libertarian minded cultures tend to do poorly in public health situations because it's every man for himself scenario. Bhutan is very much a communal responsibility culture. So, and also the prime minister has a public health background.
Yeah.
So he quickly understood what needed to be done. They shut the borders, they controlled the flow of people, they did appropriate testing, and everyone understood that they needed to minimize their contact with each other and so forth. There isn't a lot of social media penetration in Bhutan.
Mhm.
Um, is not a lot of internet usage in general compared to us in Bhutan. So they are not subject to the pollution, to the noise of social media. That helps enormously as well. Sadly, there's also an element of totalitarianism that tends to favor public health response. So nations with stronger authoritarian leadership can enact by sheer will and force the steps needed to stop transmission, as China did for a long time.
Mhm.
Nations with more liberty minded have a harder time. They have to rely upon citizen cooperation.
Mhm.
Sweden is another example. So Sweden famously had no lockdowns, etc. But people have to understand that under Swedish law, it is not possible to have enacted public health restrictions. They had to rely on public trust and cooperation.
Mhm.
So that's what they did. And there is a lot of, well, there was a fair amount of public trust in Sweden in their public health authority figures like Dr. Tegnell. So there was high compliance. But to answer your question, yeah, the couple of case studies I can think of, Bhutan high among them, the absence of social media could have
Yeah.
only helped their response.
Well, well, a lot to think about. Thank you for your time. If you have any closing remarks, please feel free to share. But
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
there was a lot.
yeah. I
So,
do have some closing remarks, and that is this: um, uh, COVID-19, I think, was a warm up for coming crises, climate change among them, other kinds of diseases. Public health is a canary in a coal mine for larger social investments in the common good. And we have failed the COVID-19 test. What we need to do is reinvest in a number of things: disease surveillance, vaccine platforms, all that great stuff. But most relevantly, in a culture of civics. So people don't understand what their role is as citizens. Our professionals don't understand what their role is to keep in their own lane. It's important that I, as an epidemiologist, don't stray and comment on things I don't really understand, because that just
mhm.
confuses the issue. And as citizens, we have to, it's our responsibility to remain scientifically literate so that
Mhm.
when crises do occur, we can be properly informed. Otherwise, our enemies, and I hate using that word, but yeah, enemies will use our weaknesses against us. And ignorance is a weakness. That's
Yeah.
it.